They found her just after sunrise, a silhouette against the blinding white. She was half buried in a fresh drift of snow, tucked under the heavy boughs of a pine tree, as if she'd laid down for a simple nap. Her skin had a bluish porcelain tint, and her simple wool dress was frozen hard into the ground, like it had grown roots and was now part of the forest floor. But it wasn't the body that stopped Merritt in her tracks. Merritt was a midwife, daughter of a trapper. She'd seen death in the wilderness before, in all its quiet, cold forms. No, what made her breath catch and freeze in her lungs was the thing pressed against the woman's chest. It was a bear cub. Tiny, no bigger than a house cat, its fur matted with snow and frozen tears. It was whimpering, a soft, pathetic sound, and its little breaths fogged the air in tiny puffs. The animal had clearly been there all night. It had clawed and dug a shallow trench in the snow, huddling against the woman's ribcage, sharing its body heat in a desperate, futile attempt to shield her from a cold that had already claimed her. Merritt had lived in these woods her entire life. She'd seen bears, tracked them, respected them, and feared them, but she had never, ever seen anything like this. She stood there, frozen herself, as soft flakes of snow continued to dust her shoulders, her gaze locked with the cub's wet, terrified brown eyes. The little creature didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth or retreat into the woods. It just stared at her, its small body trembling, its panting gaze seeming to plead with her, as if it was begging her not to take this woman away, as if it was the only thing left in the world that cared. The woman looked young, barely 20, if that. Her hands were curled tight, clutching something beneath the thin fabric of her cloak. It was the same spot the cub kept nudging with its wet nose, pushing at her hand like it was trying to wake her up. Just one more time. Merritt took a cautious step forward. The crunch of her leather boots on the snow was deafening in the silence, and it made the tiny cub flinch. But it didn't run. It held its ground, a furry little guardian refusing to abandon its post. "She's not yours, little one," Merritt whispered, her voice hoarse. She knelt down carefully, her knees sinking into the powder. The woman's skin was as cold as ice, but as Merritt's fingers brushed against her neck, searching for a pulse out of sheer habit, she felt it. It was a ghost, a flicker, a pulse so weak, so faint, it was barely there. But it was there. The woman was alive. Merritt's fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from a shock that went bone deep. She gently peeled back the edge of the woman's cloak, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected to find a wound, a weapon, something to explain this impossible scene. Instead, tucked against the woman's chest, was a folded linen shawl. Inside it was a single sliver of dried venison, half-eaten and damp, not from snow, but from the bear cub's drool. She hadn't been attacked by the cub. She had been feeding it. She had been keeping this tiny wild animal alive with her last bit of food, and in return, the cub had tried to give her its life. Merritt blinked hard, the cold stinging her eyes. She wasn't a woman who believed in signs or spirits. Her father had taught her that the woods were practical, logical, and cruel. But this was something else. This was a bond that defied all logic. The woman had nothing. No satchel, no papers, no supplies. Her feet were bare and bruised, no boots to be seen. All she had was a small, ornate locket clutched tight in her right hand, and something else Merritt almost missed. 3 long, thin claw marks were torn across the back of her skirt. But they weren't fresh. They were old. The fabric around them healed over and stiff. Someone had marked her long before the snow did. "You protected her," Merritt murmured, her words aimed at the cub. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched the creature's matted fur. To her astonishment, the cub leaned into her palm, letting out a soft, mournful cry. It was a sound of pure exhaustion. Then it did something Merritt would carry with her for the rest of her days. The cub lay back down against the woman's side, curled its tiny body into a tight ball, and closed its eyes. It refused to move. It was a silent, defiant message. Not until she wakes up. Getting the woman onto the sled was a nightmare. The cub still hadn't budged, and Merritt had to work around it, gently lifting the woman's stiff limbs. She wrapped her in every spare blanket she had, her skin like cold porcelain, her breath so faint it was invisible in the winter air. The cub finally relented when the woman was secure, and it padded silently beside the sled as Merritt began the long, arduous pull back toward her isolated cabin. It never made a sound. It just watched, its small paws leaving a soft, ghostly trail in the fresh snow behind them. Inside the cabin, the air was still and cold. Merritt worked with frantic efficiency. She threw logs into the old iron stove, set a kettle of water to boil over the flames, and carefully eased the unconscious stranger onto the narrow cot near the hearth. As the warmth of the fire began to fill the small room, she started to examine the woman more closely. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, but the tear wasn't from a fall or from the cold. It was deliberate, and beneath the rip in the fabric, a scar ran across her skin. It was old, deep, and ugly. This wasn't the mark of an animal or an accident. This was the work of a person. Someone had hurt this girl, badly, long before the wilderness had a chance. As Merritt tugged the frozen cloak free from the woman's body, something heavy slipped from its folds and clattered onto the rough wooden floor. It was the locket. A small, silver heart, tarnished with age. Merritt picked it up, her fingers fumbling with the tiny clasp. With a soft click, it sprang open. There was no picture inside, no miniature portrait of a lover or a child. Instead, there was just a tiny, folded scrap of fabric. On it, embroidered in hurried, clumsy stitches, was a single word: Junior. Merritt whispered the name aloud without meaning to. Junior. And in that instant, the woman on the cot stirred. Her frozen lips moved, dry and cracked, forming the silent shape of that exact same name, but the expression on her face wasn't one of recognition. It wasn't as if she was claiming it as her own. It was a look of pure, unadulterated grief, as if she was mourning it. Merritt leaned in closer, her heart pounding. Is that your name? Are you Junior? The woman's eyelids fluttered, a tremor running through her. But they didn't open. Instead, her hand, as if guided by some unseen force, twitched on the blanket, reaching instinctively toward the bear cub, which had now curled up on the rug by the hearth. Merritt's mind raced. What did it mean? She followed the woman's gesture, her gaze landing on the sleeping cub. Is he your kin? She asked softly, the question sounding insane even to her own ears. Your child? There was no answer, just a shallow, shaky breath. And then, a profound silence fell over the room again. The little cub, as if sensing the shift, got up from its spot. It padded over to the cot, its claws making soft clicking sounds on the floorboards. It didn't try to climb up. It simply rested its furry chin on the edge of the cot, right beside the woman's still hand. And it waited. Merritt didn't have the heart to move it. A deep, primal instinct in her gut told her that this tiny animal had done more than just keep the girl warm. It felt as if this cub had physically held on to the girl's soul when the frost had come to claim it. You're not just any wild thing, are you? Merritt whispered to the cub, her voice filled with a strange awe. You're carrying something sacred. She stood up and threw another heavy log into the fire, the flames roaring to life and casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling like a hungry wolf and shaking the cabin's shutters. But inside, these three beings, one barely alive, one lost in a silent nightmare, and one that didn't need words to tell its story, clung to a strange, unspoken bond. Merritt didn't know what was more unsettling, the woman with no past and a name that brought her sorrow, or the bear cub that behaved like a devoted child who refused to leave its mother's side. And as the night wore on, Merritt had the terrifying feeling that she hadn't just brought a stranger into her home. She had brought in a story, and the most dangerous part of that story was still out there, somewhere in the snow, waiting. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, burying the world in a thick, profound silence. The snow was so deep, it swallowed sound. Merritt stepped outside, her boots sinking to her shins, and squinted against the painful glare of the sun on the fresh powder. The pine trees were heavy, their branches sagging under the weight, the forest looking like it had forgotten color even existed. But it wasn't the beauty of the scene that made her stop. It was the absence of something. The tracks. The deep trail she and the sled had carved through the snow the night before was completely gone, erased by the storm. That made sense. What didn't make sense was that there were no other tracks leading to the pine tree where she'd found the girl. None at all. No human boot prints, no sign of a struggle, no evidence that anyone had descended from the rocky ridge above. There was just one single, strange trail. A line of tiny paw prints, the size of a bear cub, that began at the edge of the tree line, led directly to the spot where the woman had lain, and then followed the path of Merritt's sled right back to her own cabin door before vanishing. It was impossible. The woman couldn't have just appeared there. Someone had to have brought her. But the snow told a different story. The snow said only the cub had been there. Merritt turned and hurried back inside, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She bolted the door behind her. The girl was still unconscious, her lips pale as milk, but when Merritt checked her pulse, she found it had grown stronger, a steady, rhythmic beat. The cub hadn't moved from its post beside the cot all night. It blinked its dark, intelligent eyes at Merritt, as if it had been expecting her, as if it knew the questions that were forming in her mind. "Where did you come from?" Merritt asked the empty room, her voice barely a whisper. The cub just tilted its head, a silent, knowing observer. Merritt's hands felt cold. She went to the small wooden table and picked up the locket again, snapping it open. The embroidered name stared back at her. Junior. It didn't feel like the girl's name. It felt like a memory, a prayer for someone lost. Driven by a sudden urgency, Merritt rummaged through a dusty drawer and pulled out the small leather-bound ledger she used to track the few border passers and fur traders who used the old mountain paths. She flipped through the pages, a few names from the month prior. French trappers, a surveyor from the east. All men, no mention of any women, and certainly no mention of children. She was an apparition, a ghost, delivered to her doorstep by a storm and a bear. Merritt moved back toward the hearth, the warmth of the fire a small comfort against the growing chill in her soul. The cub was dozing now, its small body curled into a perfect circle. But as she looked down, she saw something tucked just beneath its furry flank. It wasn't a piece of wood from the floor. It wasn't a stray bit of fur. It was a scrap of cloth. Her breath hitched. She knelt down, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a hunter, and gently slid it out from under the sleeping animal. It was a child's mitten, hand-sewn from soft, worn wool, and on its cuff, stitched in the very same clumsy, hurried embroidery thread as the name in the locket, was a single, tiny letter. A J. The mitten was impossibly small. It matched nothing the woman on the cot was wearing. It couldn't have been hers. Which meant one thing, a conclusion so horrifying that Merritt's stomach turned to ice. There had been a fourth presence out there in the snow. "Where's the baby?" Merritt breathed, the words forming a cloud of vapor in the cold air of the cabin. The cub stirred at the sound of her voice. It lifted its head, blinking sleepily. Then, it nudged its nose, not towards the door, not towards the unconscious woman, but toward the back wall of the cabin, toward a section of floorboards that were dark and damp from the melted snow that had dripped from Merritt's sled the night before. The cub stood up, walked to that exact spot, and scratched the wood once with its claw, just a single, deliberate scrape. Then it laid its paw flat against the damp boards and looked back at Merritt. Merritt stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. Are you trying to show me something?" she asked, the sound of her own voice mocking her. She was talking to a bear cub. She was losing her mind. But the cub didn't move. It kept its paw pressed firmly to the floor, its dark eyes fixed on her, insistent, waiting. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Merritt's spine. She approached the spot slowly, as if in a trance. She knelt down and placed her own palm flat on the wood, right beside the cub's tiny paw. She couldn't explain what happened next. It wasn't a thought. It was a feeling, a surge of pure animal instinct that seemed to pass from the cub through the floorboards and into her own body. A jolt of understanding that was terrifying and absolute. Whatever had happened out there in that blizzard, this tiny creature hadn't just survived it. It had come back with a message it had been trying to deliver all along, and Merritt suddenly understood that the woman wasn't the only one this cub had been trying to save. The bear cub held its position for a long, silent moment, as if waiting for her to finally understand and to act. Merritt's gaze was locked on the damp spot its paw had marked on the rough-hewn cabin floor. Her heart was now thudding so loudly it seemed to shake her whole body, a frantic drumbeat against the howl of the wind outside. This was insane. This was the rambling of a lonely woman who'd spent too many winters in isolation. But a deeper part of her, a part that knew the language of the forest, told her this wasn't foolish. This was necessary. She reached for the heavy iron crowbar she kept leaning by the hearth for splitting stubborn logs. "If you're wrong about this," she muttered to the cub, her voice tight, "I'm just tearing up a perfectly good floor for nothing." She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam between two boards and pushed down with all her weight. The old wood groaned in protest, the nails screeching as they were pulled from the joists. The first board came up with a loud crack. Beneath it was nothing but cold, damp earth. Merritt's heart sank. She was a fool, but the cub hadn't moved. It just watched her, its gaze unwavering. Gritting her teeth, she set the crowbar to the next board. This one came up easier, and as it lifted away, she gasped. There, buried in a shallow hollow scooped out of the dirt beneath her cabin, was a pale cloth sack. It was tied shut with a thick leather cord. Merritt's hands trembled as she reached down and yanked it free. The sack was soft and shockingly light, but as she lifted it, she felt a faint, almost imperceptible movement from within. Her breath caught in her throat. Her fingers, now clumsy and shaking, worked at the knot in the leather cord. It finally came loose, and she peeled open the top of the sack, and she fell to her knees. Inside, swaddled tightly, lay an infant. Its eyes were closed, its skin a pale, waxy color, but as Merritt watched, its tiny chest rose and fell in a shallow, fragile rhythm. It was breathing. It was alive. But it wasn't wrapped in a blanket or a piece of wool. It was wrapped in a white lace wedding dress. The expensive, delicate fabric was bunched and folded around the tiny body, as if it was meant to be a makeshift shield, not just from the cold, but from the world itself. "Dear Lord," Merritt whispered, the words stolen from her lungs. As if in response to her voice, the baby stirred. It let out a single croaky cry, a sound so weak it was more like the rasp of dry leaves than a human voice. It was a sound of profound weakness, but it was a sound of life. The bear cub, its duty seemingly done, leaned forward. It gave the baby's tiny, swaddled foot one single, gentle lick. Then it stepped back, sitting on its haunches and watching Merritt, as if it were officially passing a sacred task from its own shoulders to hers. Merritt couldn't take her eyes off the wedding dress. She looked closer, running her fingers over the intricate lace. The hem was torn, stained with dirt and melted snow, and near the seam there was a dark, ugly smear of dried blood. The baby's tiny, bird-like hand was clutched tightly around that very seam, as if even in its unconscious state, it knew what it had been wrapped in and was holding on for dear life. Merritt's own voice cracked. "Who would do this?" she breathed, looking from the baby to the cub. "Who would bury a baby like this? And why you?" She looked directly at the cub. "You dug her out, didn't you? You knew where she was." The cub just blinked its dark eyes slowly. Cradling the infant to her chest, Merritt tried to warm its tiny, cold body with her own. It made another small sound, a whimper that sounded less like hunger and more like a deep, ancient sorrow. In that moment, Merritt swore she could feel something ancient and powerful stirring in the room, as if the very walls of her cabin were awake and listening, bearing witness to this strange, impossible miracle. And then, from the cot by the fire, a voice. The girl, still lost in her unconscious state, turned her head toward the fire, her lips parting. She whispered a single name, clear as a bell in the silent room. "Eva." Merritt froze, the baby held tight against her heart. Was that the girl's name? Or the baby's? Or was it the name of someone else entirely? Someone lost to the storm? She didn't know, but a cold certainty settled in her gut. That name, like the wedding dress, the claw marks, the locket, and the loyal bear cub, was another piece of a terrifying puzzle that was just beginning to take shape. And now, whether she wanted to be or not, she was standing right in the middle of it. Merritt didn't sleep a wink that night. How could she? The infant, whom she now thought of as Iva, was nestled in a makeshift basket by the hearth, finally stable, but still eerily quiet. A newborn should cry, it should fuss. This one was as silent as the snow outside. The young woman on the cot, the one with the haunted name in her locket, had yet to wake. And the bear cub, their strange little guardian, had curled itself tightly into a ball beneath the main table, its watchful eyes never leaving the flickering firelight. As the first gray fingers of dawn crept in, painting the frost on the window panes, Merritt tried again to make sense of the pieces. A girl with no name, but Junior in a locket. A loyal bear cub that had somehow led her to a baby buried alive. A baby wrapped in a blood-stained wedding dress. And now, a new name whispered in a fever dream, Iva. It was a story with too many beginnings and no end. She went to the wash basin, the water so cold it stung her skin. She splashed her face, trying to shock herself into some kind of clarity, and stared at her reflection in the small, warped mirror she kept nailed to the wall. She looked older than her 33 years. Too many lonely, hard winters had carved their lines into her face, but it wasn't her own reflection that startled her. It was the sound from behind her, a voice, small, weak, but clear. "Where? Where's the cub?" Merritt spun around so fast she nearly knocked over the basin. The girl was sitting up. She was pale as a ghost, her body shaking from weakness, but her eyes were open. She was awake. "He's right there," Merritt said softly, her voice gentle as she stepped closer to the cot. "He hasn't left your side." The girl's gaze fell on the small bundle of fur under the table. A look of profound relief washed over her face. "He waited," she whispered, her voice cracking. She tried to shift, grabbing at her side as a wave of pain shot through her. Merritt knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her arm. "You're safe now. You're in my cabin. Can you tell me your name?" The girl didn't answer the question. Her eyes, wide and terrified, had fallen on the basket by the hearth. She saw the swaddled bundle inside. A choked gasp escaped her lips. "No," she breathed, her face contorting in horror. I thought." She reached for the child with desperate, trembling hands. "Please," she choked out, her voice breaking into sobs. Is she breathing?" "Barely," Merritt said, her own voice tight with emotion. "But yes, she's alive." Tears, hot and silent, poured down the girl's hollow cheeks. She buried her face in her hands, her body racked with violent, silent sobs. "I couldn't," she gasped, the words torn from her. "I buried her. I thought she was already gone. I had to." Merritt's blood ran cold. "You buried her?" "They told me to," the girl cried, her words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and grief. "They said if I didn't do it, they'd make the bear finish what they started." Merritt froze, her hand still on the girl's arm. "Who? Who told you to do that?" "The ones who caught us," she whispered, her eyes wild with a terrible memory. "The men who were taking us across the border. We weren't supposed to survive the crossing." "We?" Merritt asked gently, trying to piece it together. "You and the baby?" "No," the girl said, her tear-filled eyes finally locking with Merritt's. Her next words hit Merritt like a physical blow. "Me, the baby, and the boy who never made it out of the woods." She clutched at her ribs again, her body curling in on itself with the phantom pain of memory. And in that gut-wrenching moment, Merritt finally understood. The baby wasn't the girl's, the name Junior in the locket. It wasn't her, it was the boy's, and the wedding dress. That beautiful, tragic shroud. It hadn't come from a place of hope or love. It had come from a shallow grave, and somewhere out there in the vast, silent wilderness, the men who had put it there still believed they had silenced the story it carried forever. By midday, the relentless snowfall had finally lightened, and a weak, watery sun tried to push through the thick clouds. The girl, who Merritt now quietly accepted must be Iva, had drifted back into a fragile, exhausted sleep. The infant, now fed with a bit of watered-down goat's milk, was swaddled tightly and sleeping against Iva's chest. The loyal bear cub still wouldn't leave their side. But something in the cabin had shifted. The air no longer felt empty or haunted. It felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Merritt slung her father's old rifle over her shoulder before she stepped outside. She wasn't looking for game. She was looking for threats. She circled the cabin slowly, her eyes scanning the landscape not for animal tracks, but for human ones. It didn't take long to find them. Behind the woodshed, past a thicket of brush that had been flattened by the heavy snowfall, was a single trail of footprints. They were fresh, human. The boots were heavy, the stride long and confident. They were heading from the direction of the old creek bed, away from the main trail. She crouched down, her fingers hovering over one of the deep indentations. There was no fresh snow inside the print. That meant they were recent, made after the storm had stopped this morning. Too recent. A cold dread crept up her spine. She followed the trail, her own boots sinking into the crusted snow. Every step she took seemed to thunder in the oppressive silence. These weren't the tracks of someone just passing by. The path wasn't straight. It paced. It circled. It paused for long stretches. Someone had stood behind her cabin for hours, watching. And not just watching, listening. The footprints finally ended at the exact same spot where the bear cub had scratched the wall, right above the place in the dirt where Merritt had found the buried child. Her entire body went rigid. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rifle. Whoever had left these tracks, they hadn't come back to check on a grave. They had come back to make sure the evidence was still buried. They didn't realize that Merritt had already discovered the secret they'd tried to hide under her own floorboards. Or worse. Maybe they did. She scrambled back to the cabin, her heart hammering. She bolted the heavy wooden door behind her, the sound echoing in the small space. Iva stirred as Merritt frantically added more logs to the fire, stoking it until it roared. "He was one of them," Iva whispered, her eyes still closed as if she'd felt Merritt's fear. "Who?" Merritt knelt beside the cot again. "The one who left the tracks," Iva said, her voice raspy. "One of the men who bought us. The one with the ring, the big silver ring with a mark on it." Merritt said nothing, waiting. Iva's eyes fluttered open, dark and filled with a pain that seemed ancient. "They wanted the baby gone," she whispered, She wasn't his. She belonged to my sister. Merritt blinked, her mind reeling. Another twist. Your sister? Then whose wedding dress was it? My sister's too, Iva breathed. She died giving birth, out there in the woods. They wouldn't help her. They just watched. And when it was over, they blamed me for the noise. Iva looked down at the sleeping infant, her expression a mixture of love and terror. The baby. She never cried when she was born. Not a sound. I truly thought she hadn't survived. So I wrapped her up. I wrapped her in my sister's dress so the cold would finish what they started. It felt kinder than what they would have done. She paused, her gaze shifting to the bear cub. But the cub, he never left her side. He just laid on top of her. Merritt stared at the small, furry creature who was now curled protectively around the infant again, his little tail flicking gently. But why? Why would a wild animal guard a human child? Iva's lips trembled. Because he wasn't really wild. Not completely. He was raised near our village, an orphan. My sister. She fed him scraps from our table since he was born. She saved him. She called him Ghost, because he was so quiet. And then Merritt finally, truly understood. The animal wasn't just protecting a random child. He was guarding the last piece of the person who had shown him kindness. He was keeping a promise that someone, the man with the silver ring, desperately wanted erased from the world. That night, long after Iva had fallen back into a medicated, restless sleep, and even the vigilant cub had finally closed its eyes, Merritt couldn't rest. The story kept twisting through her thoughts like smoke through the rafters of the cabin. A baby wrapped in a dead woman's wedding dress. A sister who had died in secret. A grieving boy named Junior, lost to the wilderness. And the girl in her cot, haunted, hunted, and somehow, miraculously, still holding on. She couldn't just wait for them to come back. She had to know what she was up against. She lit a lantern, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows. She grabbed the small, sharp knife she used for whittling kindling and slipped outside. The air had gone utterly still, cold as a shard of glass, but the biting cruelty had gone out of it. The snow crunched loudly beneath her boots as she retraced the stranger's footprints from earlier, the lantern light swinging in a wide arc in front of her. This time, she wasn't just looking at the tracks. She was looking for what else he might have left behind. A sign. A message. At the edge of the dark pine forest, she found it. A single ancient tree had been scarred by a blade. The cuts were fresh, the raw wood underneath glowing pale in the lantern light. They were shallow but deliberate. She raised the lantern higher, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a name that had been carved there. It wasn't a random set of scratches. It was a symbol. 3 sharp, intersecting lines, forming a jagged, ugly shape that made her stomach clench and turn to ice. She had seen it once before, years ago. It had been branded onto the side of a wooden crate full of stolen girls, rescued from a brutal trafficking route that ran through the Northern Territories. That mark wasn't a warning. It belonged to a specific group of men. Men who didn't deal in furs or timber. They dealt in flesh. And now, they were here. Their poison had seeped into her isolated corner of the world. Too close. She ran a hand over the fresh gash in the tree's bark, feeling the sharp edges of the cuts. Whoever had left this mark wanted it to be found. It was both a warning and a claim, a way of saying, "We know you have our property, and we are coming back for it." Merritt didn't frighten easily. She had faced down blizzards, starving wolves, and the crushing loneliness of the mountains. But this was different. This wasn't a fear of the wild. This was a fear of men. This was about the past, rising up like a thawed river in spring, dragging all of its rot and filth right to her front door. She turned and ran back to the cabin, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Inside, the fire had burned low. The cub had shifted in its sleep and was now lying directly on top of the baby, its small, warm body acting like a living blanket, a second heartbeat against the child's chest. As the door clicked shut behind her, Iva stirred. Her eyes opened in the dim light. She must have seen the look on Merritt's face. "You found it, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The mark." Merritt could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "Yes." Iva closed her eyes again, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "That's why I ran," she breathed. "When they took us, I saw it, burned onto the silver of his ring." She nodded her head weakly toward the sleeping infant. "She's not just someone's child," Iva whispered, her voice filled with a chilling certainty. "She's their mistake, their loose end. They tried to bury her, and they forgot one thing." "What did they forget?" Merritt asked, her voice low. Iva's eyes flicked open, and they were burning with a fire Merritt hadn't seen before. "They forgot that the land remembers." Merritt crouched beside her, the weight of the rifle on her shoulder, a sudden, heavy comfort. "They're coming back for her, aren't they?" Iva nodded once, a small, sharp movement. "Or," she added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "to finish what they couldn't." Merritt's hand moved from the barrel of the rifle to its stock, her grip tightening. A grim resolve settled over her, cold and hard as the iron of the stove. She looked from the haunted girl to the innocent baby, to the brave little cub. They had all been marked for death by a world that didn't care, but they had made it here, to her door. "Then they'll find something they never planned on," Merritt said, her voice a low growl. Iva looked at her, confusion warring with fear in her eyes. "What?" Merritt's gaze was hard as granite. "Me." The next morning, the tracks had returned. But this time, they were not the tracks of a single man on foot. They were deep, wide ruts, carved into the snow by the slow-moving, heavy wheels of a wagon. And Merritt, standing at the crest of the small trail behind her cabin, could count the distinct paths. Not one wagon, 3. Her heart clenched into a tight, painful knot. No one, absolutely no one, used that old, forgotten path in the dead of winter. It was treacherous and led nowhere of consequence. No one used it, except for people who had a very good reason for not wanting to be seen. She hurried back inside, her mind racing. She slid the heavy bolt on the door, a reflexive action, though she knew a piece of wood would do nothing to stop them if they were determined. Eva was sitting up in the cot, her face pale but her eyes clear and sharp. She had somehow grown stronger overnight, as if Merritt's resolve had infused her with a new strength of her own. The bear cub, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, was awake and alert, standing a silent vigil by the baby's basket. "They're here, aren't they?" Iva asked, her voice low and steady. There was no fear in it now, only a grim acceptance. "Soon," Merritt said, her voice equally grim. "How many?" "Too many." Merritt crossed to the fireplace. High on the mantel, resting on 2 wooden pegs, was her father's old revolver. It hadn't been fired in years, but she kept it cleaned and oiled like a sacred relic. She took it down, the cold, heavy steel feeling strangely natural in her hand. She checked the chambers. All 6 were loaded. Eva's hands trembled as she carefully lifted the sleeping baby from the basket, clutching the child to her chest. "We can run," she whispered, her voice a desperate plea. "We can try to make it to the ravine." "They'll smell your fear on the wind," Merritt said, her voice gentle but firm. "And the baby's scent. They'll track us down before we get a mile." Just then, a low groaning sound drifted through the cabin walls. The sound of heavy wagon wheels crunching through crusted snow. It was followed by the nicker of a horse. "Closer now," Merritt whispered. She moved to the window, peering through a tiny slit in the wooden shutters. The sight made her stomach tighten into a cold, hard knot. 3 wagons, just as she'd suspected. And standing beside the lead wagon were 3 men. They were dressed in thick winter coats, but their faces were hard and cruel. One of them, a large, broad-shouldered man, had a glint of silver on his hand. Even from this distance, Merritt could see the light catch on his ring. The ring with the mark. Her blood ran cold. "He's here," she said, her voice flat. Iva paled, her eyes widening in recognition. "That man. He's not just after the baby. He's the one who—" She stopped, her voice cracking, unable to finish the sentence. At that moment, the bear cub let out a low, guttural growl. It was a sound that seemed far too deep and menacing to come from such a small creature. It moved from the baby's side and stood directly in front of the bolted door, planting its small body as if it had made a final decision about who it belonged to now. Merritt moved quickly. She took an old, worn shawl and wrapped it around Iva and the baby, creating a makeshift sling. She handed it gently to Iva, her eyes locking with the girl's. "If I fall," Merritt whispered, her voice urgent, "you take the north trail. Don't stop for anything. Hide where the icicles grow thick from the rocks. There's a hidden ravine there. No man on horseback can follow you." "And you?" Iva asked, her voice trembling, her eyes shining with tears. "What about you?" Merritt looked down at the brave little cub standing guard at the door, then at the innocent child bundled in Iva's arms. A lifetime of solitude, of quiet grief and lonely winters, suddenly clicked into place. It all made sense now. "I already made my peace with the world a long time ago," Merritt said, a strange sense of calm washing over her. "I just never knew what for. Now I do." The first knock on the door was sharp and loud, deliberate, an announcement, not a request. A gruff voice called out, "Open up, lady. We're just here to collect what's ours." A fire ignited in Merritt's eyes. She stepped toward the door, the heavy revolver held loosely at her side. "Then you should have taken better care of her," she called back, her voice ringing with a cold fury. She didn't flinch as her hand reached for the bolt. Behind her, she heard the faint shuffle of feet as Iva and the cub disappeared into the shadows of the back room, clutching the one thing that no man outside had ever held with any semblance of honor: innocence. With a deep breath, Merritt slid the bolt free. The door creaked open, flooding the dim cabin with a blinding slice of snowlight. 3 men stood there, their faces weathered and chapped by the wind, their eyes as sharp and cold as ice chips. Their clothes were too clean, their gear too new for trappers or woodsmen. They were from the town. They were men of means. The one in the front, the big one with the silver ring, offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who already owned the ground he stood on, and everything on it. "You took something that don't belong to you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He glanced past Merritt, his eyes scanning the cabin's interior as if she were nothing more than a broken gate he had to step over. "No," Merritt replied, her voice eerily calm. "I kept something from being thrown away like trash." The ringed man took a step forward, his shadow falling over her. His hand rested casually on the butt of the pistol holstered at his belt. "That's my business, not yours," he said, his smile fading. "That child is marked. She's part of a debt owed to my family." Merritt didn't blink. "Then I guess I've just bought that debt." From the back of the cabin, a floorboard creaked. It was a tiny sound, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. The man's eyes narrowed, and his hand twitched, his fingers tightening on his pistol. And then, before Merritt could raise her own weapon, before she could even speak, he drew his pistol with lightning speed. But he never got the shot off. A roar erupted from the loft above them. It wasn't the growl of a cub. This was a deep, guttural, earth-shaking sound of pure, maternal rage. Everyone froze. The men outside. Merritt in the doorway. Time itself seemed to stop. The cub hadn't just been a warning. It had been a herald. This was its mother. A full-grown she-bear, a monster of fur and muscle, lunged from the shadows of the attic where it must have been hiding for days. It crashed down onto the main floor like a bolt of lightning, a living avalanche of fury. Its jaws were wide, its teeth bared, and its eyes were locked on one thing and one thing only: the silver ring on the man's hand. The men screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror. Two of them turned and fled without a second thought, scrambling for the safety of their wagons. The ringed man, caught completely by surprise, managed to fire one wild shot that went wide, splintering the doorframe just inches from Merritt's head. Then the beast was on him. It knocked him flat on his back with a single swipe of its massive paw, the pistol flying from his hand and disappearing into a snowdrift. Merritt didn't move. She didn't scream. She just watched. And in that terrifying, awe-inspiring moment, she finally knew. The little cub hadn't followed Iva out of some vague sense of loyalty. It had stayed behind because it remembered. It had led its mother here. It remembered what Merritt had done so many years ago when she had found a half-dead, starving she-bear on her porch, and instead of shooting it, had left out a bucket of milk and a side of venison. An act of kindness she had long since forgotten. The bear had not. The massive she-bear did not kill the man. Its purpose was not murder. It was justice. She pinned the man to the ground, her immense weight crushing the air from his lungs. She snarled, her hot breath close enough to frost his eyelashes. Then, with a final contemptuous snort, she turned and lumbered into the cabin. She walked straight to the back room where Iva was huddled in the corner, shielding the baby with her own body. The bear stood before them, a towering shadow in the dim light. She lowered her massive head and gently, so gently, sniffed the swaddled infant. Then she looked at Merritt, a long, silent look that passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. And then, just as silently as she had arrived, she turned and left, her small cub trailing faithfully behind her, leaving the chaos and the wreckage in their wake. When it was all over, only the ringed man remained. He was curled in the snow, broken and defeated, his eyes wide, not with pain but with a look of stunned, terrified awe. He stared at Merritt, his voice a choked whisper. You kept it alive." Merritt stepped over him, picking up his fallen pistol from the snow. "No," she said, her voice cold and clear. "She did." She gestured with the pistol toward the cabin, where Iva now stood in the doorway, the baby safe in her arms. "I just gave her a choice." And for the first time in a very long time, Merritt knew exactly what kind of woman she had become. Not a recluse, not a savior, just someone who had once shown a small bit of kindness to a creature of the wild, a creature that hadn't yet learned how to hate, a creature that remembered. By the time the spring thaw came, the snow had melted so completely that the trail leading to Merritt's porch was clearly visible from half a mile away. It was a path now rutted not just with the marks of her own boots, but with the constant, tiny paw prints of a growing bear cub and the careful, steady steps of a young woman who was learning how to walk again, not just physically, but in the world. Eva now moved with a quiet, steely confidence. The baby, whom they had officially named Iva Jr. in a silent tribute to the boy and the sister she'd lost, was always near. And the bear cub, who they simply called Ghost, was never far. The mother bear had not returned since that fateful winter day. She had done what she came to do. She had repaid her debt, but her story had spread like wildfire through the nearby town. When Merritt and Iva had walked into the town clerk's office to register the baby under a new name, no one dared to ask questions. The story of the recluse in the woods and the avenging ghost bear that protected her had become local legend overnight. The ringed man and his family, once powerful and feared, were now disgraced, their dark secrets exposed to the light. They had quietly packed their wagons and vanished, their power broken by a story no one would have believed if the evidence wasn't still there, in the form of a brave young woman and her child. Merritt had built a small, sturdy pen just beyond her porch. It wasn't to cage anything. It was a reminder of the boundaries that exist between fear and faith, between the wildness of the world and the shelter of care, between what is lost and what might still be claimed from the wreckage. One sunny afternoon, she sat at her small table and wrote a letter. It was to a man she hadn't seen in nearly a decade, the patriarch of the disgraced family, the ringed man's father. The letter contained only one simple sentence. She lived, though you never thought she would. She mailed it from town the next day, not expecting or even wanting a reply. That was never the point. The point was to let him know that his attempt to bury his sin had failed, that it had a name, and it had a future. Eva had started to draw again. Her sketches, done with charcoal from the fire, now filled the walls of the small cabin. There was one of the baby, Iva Jr., sleeping peacefully while holding onto Ghost's ear like it was a security blanket. There was another of a single silver ring lying abandoned in the snow. And her favorite was a drawing of Merritt, standing alone at the cabin door, her shadow stretching out behind her, taller and stronger than the cabin itself. "You should sign them," Merritt told her one evening as they watched the sunset. Iva smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "You already signed them for me," she said softly. "I never would have made it here without you." But Merritt just shook her head, a rare smile touching her own lips. "I didn't save you," she said, her gaze drifting to the two small figures sleeping by the hearth. "A cub did. I just learned not to get in the way." That evening, as twilight painted the forest in shades of purple and blue, Iva placed her final sketch on the windowsill to dry. It was of the bear cub, Ghost, curled protectively around the sleeping baby by the hearth. Both were asleep. Both were safe. Outside, the forest seemed to exhale a long, peaceful breath, and as Merritt stood at the open door, watching the last light fade from the sky, she thought she saw a shape moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. A large, dark shadow, just out of reach, a silent guardian watching over her new, strange, and beautiful family. It was there for only a moment, and then it disappeared back into the deep green of the woods. Merritt knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that some stories don't ever need to be retold. They just need to be lived, once, with enough courage and kindness that the whole world remembers. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of kindness, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the wild heart of the world. And let us know in the comments below. If you had been Merritt and found that woman in the snow, what would you have done? We want to hear your story.